Okay, Rabbi, we're on DAF Ches Amud Aleph, and we got down pretty far into the DAF because it's such. I mean, you really have to learn it all together in order for it to make any sense. We had a question yesterday on a statement from Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan said that if you want to have a circular sukkah, it's perfectly okay. You want to have a cylindrical sukkah, no problem, provided that the square that is inside the sukkah is a 4x4 square. And, you know, when you think about it, that all that should be necessary is to have a circle that has a diameter of 4, or actually more than 4. It would have to be the hypotenuse of a 4x4 square. So it would be about 5.6 amos. Now, in order to accomplish, if you only had a circle with a diameter of 5.6 times 3 is a little bit less than 17. And so basically that would explain why you would need to have a circle of that size. But that's not what Rabbi Yochanan had seemingly said. Rabbi Yochanan had seemingly said you need to have a circle that's so large that 24 people can sit around it. And we had a question, how could that be that you have 24 people, each person's girth is 1 amma, so it seems like he's saying that you need a circle that has a circumference of 24, when it turns out that at the most you'd need a circle whose circumference is a little bit less than 18. 16.8 is what we had come out with. So that was what we were left with as a question. And the Gemara had answered yesterday, one answer at least that the Gemara gives, is that we're talking about people sitting outside the circle, not people sitting inside the circle. So therefore you really have two imaginary circles, or you have one imaginary circle and one real circle. The imaginary circle outside where the people sit is 24 in circumference. But the circle, let's say if you imagine all 24 men sitting Indian style with their backs to the cylinder, okay? So if you draw an imaginary circle around them, that's 24 in circumference. But since each human being sitting Indian style is 1 by 1 amma, so then it's going to turn out that you shorten the diameter of the circle, of the outer circle, by 2 ammas, because you have to take into account the width or the length of each person's body, which is 1 amma. So then it turns out that the circumference of the inner circle is going to be based not on a diameter of 8, which would give you a circle of 24, but would be a diameter of 6. And so that would give you a circumference of roughly 18. And there the Gemara says, even though it's a little bit less than 17, which is really what you need in order to accomplish a 4x4 square inside the circle, a little bit less than 17 can be rounded up to 18 for the purposes of rounding, and so that you don't make a mistake. And therefore, the math works out. When Rabbi Yochanan says you need enough for 24 people to sit around the cylinder, it's their backs are to the cylinder, and it turns out, therefore, that the circumference of that circle is going to be a little bit less than 17. That's really what he meant to say. So the Gemara now says, Rabbanan de Kesari, we're on the bottom 2 lines of DAF Ches Amud Aleph. Rabbanan de Kesari, v'amri la dayani de Kesari amri. So either the rabbis of Kesari or the judges of Kesari, we're not sure who these people are, but they make an outlandish statement, and they say, Igula denafik migav ribua riva. We had said, remember, we had talked about 2 different scenarios. One is where the square bounds on the outside of the circle, and the other, and that's really where the square is larger than the circle, but not by much. It's 25% larger in area. But ribua denafik migavigula palga. The Gemara says, but when you put a square inside a circle so that the square is bounded by a circle, that's the second diagram on the page, so then the Gemara says these rabbis of Kesari were of the opinion that the square is 50% smaller than the circle. And if it's 50% smaller than the circle, which Rashi explains it means, it's 2/3 of the size of the area of the circle. So therefore, when you think about it like that, it turns out that if you have a circle that's a circumference of 24, then the circumference of the square will be 16, because it's 2/3. 2/3 of 24 is 16. You divide 24 into 3 parts, you get 8. So 8 plus 8 is 16. So the circumference of the square, when you measure all sides of the square, you get 16. That's 4 by 4. And that's why you need a 4 by 4. That's why you need a circle the circumference of 24. In other words, the rabbis of Kesari reject the previous answer that we're talking about a circle with the circumference of less than 17. And they say, rather, no, we're talking about a circle with the circumference of 24. How do you get a square in there that's 4 by 4? The answer is because that's the actual math. That's the ratio. When you have a square that's has a circle around it, the square is much, much smaller than the circle, and that's what you need in order to have a 4 by 4 square. The Gemara says velohi kachazinan delohavi kulehai, but the Gemara says that just the mathematics of those rabbis of Kesari just doesn't work out. That's not mathematically accurate, because we see very clearly that if you put a square inside a circle, it's not 50% smaller than the circle. It's actually a closer ratio to the circle. And all we said, it's the Pythagorean theorem. If you have a circle with the circumference of 24, that means it has a diameter of 8, when you take into account that pi is around 3, and therefore the hypotenuse of any square that's bounded inside that circle is going to be that measurement. And because a squared plus b squared equals c squared, so you take basically 8 squared is 64, and you take that and divide it in half to get the a squared plus b squared, and so it's each side will be the square root of 32. The square root of 32 is about 5.6. So therefore it's much larger. It's not 4 by 4, it's 5.6 by 5.6. That's way too large. So the Gemara says this is patently untrue. The question, of course, is how could the rabbis of Kesari, they're not foolish, if it's apparent from even the most cursory review of looking at a circle with the square inside of it, how could these rabbis be so off the mark when we see clearly, you don't have to be a mathematical genius to see that the ratios are just not the way they're describing it. This requires a lot more analysis, but let me just offer just one idea that you can think of, and then we'll go weiter. It's true that the square that's inside a circle is not 50% smaller, but when you draw another circle inside the square that's inside the circle, then you get a ratio that's much closer to what these rabbis are talking about. Why that is relevant, I'm not sure. I haven't figured that out. But you can, if you like math, this is a good place for you to.
Low duck just get you out of all this.
No, low duck doesn't. Like the Gemara said, you can't round up from you can't round up from 17 to 24.
Yeah,
that's what the Gemara said. That's ridiculous. Yeah. Okay, let us go weiter. Amar Rabbi Levi mishum Reb Meir. Shtei sukkos shel yotzrim zu lifnim mizu hapinimis ein sukkah v'chayeves b'mezuzah v'hachitzon sukkah upetur min hamezuzah. Now, let's first understand the illustration. This is called a potter's shack or a potter's shed. And the way that typically potters would set up shop is that if you're an itinerant potter, so you set up a shed by the marketplace, and you have 2 chambers. One is the inner chamber further away from the front, which is where you sleep. The outer chamber is where you set up shop, where you make your pots, and then you set them up in front of the shop in order to sell them. So that's the illustration that the Gemara is providing us with. The idea here is as follows. Whatever is good as a sukkah will not work, is going to be patur from mezuzah, and whatever is chayiv in mezuzah will not work as a sukkah. Why is that? Because a sukkah by definition is a dira sarai. It's a temporary residence. It's not designated for permanent residence. In order for something to be chayiv in mezuzah, it has to be designated as a permanent residence. So the way it works is like this. The inner chamber of this potter's shed is meant for his sleeping quarters. So he's going to be there for several days, weeks, or months at a time. And therefore it needs a mezuzah. But you can't use it as a sukkah, because since it was set up as a permanent residence, and sukkah by definition is a dira sarai, is a temporary dwelling, so then this is not going to work. However, if he decides that on the holiday of Sukkot he's going to sleep and eat in the front part of his shed, and assuming that it's got the proper schach on top of it, then that's perfectly okay. Why? Because this was never designated as a permanent residence. This is not normally where he sleeps. And I guess the same thing would be true, is that let's say you don't have a place to make a sukkah, but you have an office space, and your office space has a removable roof. So technically you could make that into a sukkah because it's not designated as a permanent residence. So that's what makes it work as a sukkah. But it's patur from mezuzah because it's not meant as a residence, and only a chamber that's meant as a residence is chayiv in mezuzah. Which is, by the way, we get this question a lot. Do I have to put a mezuzah on my office door? The answer is technically no, but the minhag is to do it anyway because you want to be able to kiss the mezuzah every day when you come to work. So you'll remember that what goes on in my office has to be as holy as what goes on in my home. So, but the important thing to remember is that you don't make a bracha on affixing a mezuzah to your office. Yes?
What about sukkahs that are within the house that have a radiant within the house?
So once you remove the bubble, you've changed it. You've essentially changed that structure so that it's no longer the original structure that it was. Okay, so the Gemara's question now is, Va'amai, why is the outer chamber of the shed patur from mezuzah? Tihavi chitzona kibei shara penimis v'tischayev mezuzah. What we know, there's a halacha that when you have an antechamber that leads into a house, let's say you have an enclosed patio in front of your house. The enclosed patio is not a residence, that's clear. But since it's a chamber that leads into your home, that's your sha'ar, that's your gate. And the Torah says you have to put a mezuzah on the gate that leads into your home. So why shouldn't that outer chamber of the potter's studio, why shouldn't that be chayiv mezuzah as well? The Gemara answer is mishum delo kavia. The answer is because it doesn't have the same permanence or importance. Rashi explains, lozu velozu davar kavua. Neither chamber of the potter's shed is something that is so established. Veina penimis chashuva lios labeshar. And the inner chamber is not important enough to warrant an antechamber. The only time that an antechamber to a structure is chayiv and mezuzah is when that the inner chamber is of such substance and importance that it warrants having an antechamber. But this potter's shed, the entire structure is drek. It's not meant to last, and so therefore to have an antechamber to such a structure, that's not really true. It's not really an antechamber, and therefore it's patur from mezuzah. So let us go on. Tonu Rabbana. The Brisa now says, now what we're going to see later on in just a few minutes, there's going to be a Mishnah on the next Amud that's going to teach us that this only works according to Beis Hillel. This whole discussion only works according to Beis Hillel. Because clearly when this potter made his structure that has foliage on top, he wasn't thinking about the holiday of Sukkot. He needed a place to make pots. He needed a place to sleep temporarily while he was selling his pots for a few weeks in the marketplace. So he put this thing up. It turns out that it works out as a sukkah as well. What you see clearly from this discussion is that you don't need to make the structure l'shem sukkah. It doesn't have to be made l'shem sukkah. Right? As we're going to see, there's a discussion, there's a debate about this, whether... What? Well, not so much mitzvah srichas kavana, because the truth is that that's only when you're sitting in the sukkah. Do I need to have kavana that I'm... No, but that's not... The mitzvah is yeshiva sukkah. The mitzvah is not asiyah sukkah. So this is really this is a hechsher mitzvah, and what we're learning here is that the construction of the sukkah does not have to be l'shem sukkah. Right? I don't believe that it's an issue of mitzvah strichas kavan or not, but maybe the Gemara will have that discussion later on. I don't remember. But anyway, Tanu Rabbana. The Brisa now says Ganbach, this which is an acronym, Gimel Nun Beis Chaf, four different types of sukkah construction. Sukkahs Goyim, Sukkahs Noshim, Sukkahs Behema, Sukkahs Kusim. It makes no difference that it's constructed by people who either are not chayiv in the mitzvah, such as a Gentile or a woman, Ted, right, or Eugene, right, or whether the constructor of the sukkah doesn't even have das at all, doesn't even have cognizance. Like, let's say I train a monkey to go to Home Depot for me and pick up the materials, and he builds the sukkah for me. My monkey builds the sukkah for me. So the halacha would be that's still a kosher sukkah, even though there's no das at all. So clearly it can't be l'shem sukkah. Okay? So sukkah mikol makom, or if it's a sukkah, no matter how you make it, we'll see what that refers to, kishera, that sukkah is still kosher, uvilvad shetehei mesucheches kihilchasa, provided that there's kosher schach, that the schach is made according to halacha. So the Gemara says, "My kilchasa." What kind of statement is that last statement? That the schach is made according to halacha. That's self-evident. Why would I think that you wouldn't need to have schach on it? I mean, why? Just because a monkey made it, it's potter from schach? Of course, it's got to have schach kilchasa. So what does that statement mean? So Amar Rav Chisda v'husha asa'a l'tzel sukkah. The answer is that it has to have been constructed. You're right. It doesn't have to be made l'shem mitzvah sukkah, but it has to be made l'shem tzel. It has to be that I'm constructing this to provide shade to the occupant. If it's not made for that purpose, to protect the person from sun or other elements, and it wasn't made for l'shem sukkah, so then it's not kosher. You'd have what?
The monkey doesn't have dust to make shade.
So I suppose you'd have to argue with the monkey that the monkey can be instructed as long as I'm guiding the monkey along, and I'm guiding him in order how to make the sukkah. That's considered to be appending the das of the owner of the monkey. That's the only way I was able to figure it out.
It was built for shade, not necessarily for the mitzvah schach. It was built that it produced shade.
Correct. But Bob's question was, how does a monkey have that in mind? Right? So you have to say that even the monkey has some level. Either the monkey has some level of understanding that this is providing shade, or that the owner of the monkey is guiding the monkey along. So the Gemara now says, Mikol makom la asuye mai. So now the question is, what were the words, if it's a sukkah mikol makom, if it's a sukkah no matter what, it's still going to be kosher. What is that coming to include? La asuye sukkahs rakbash. There are another 4 kinds of structural sukkahs from a second brisa, and Rakbash stands for Reish Kuf Beish, and the Tana Rabbanan Sukkahs Rakbash, which stands for Sukkahs Roim, Sukkahs Kayotzim, Sukkahs Borganim, and Sukkahs Shomrei Peiros. These are huts or sentry posts that are made very temporarily, and sometimes you put them up, you pop them up just for a day, and when you're done with your job, you dismantle it. A sukkah of a shepherd. A hut of a kayatz, which is a person who watches over drying fruit to protect it from thieves. Sukkahs burganim, a hut that is set up by the town sentries to watch the city borders to make sure that there's no invaders. Sukkahs shomrei peiros, people who watch the field when the crops are growing. Right? All of these cases are sukkah, or a sukkah mikol makom, or a sukkah no matter what. Then that's kind of sukkah is kishera. Uvilvad shetei mesucheches kehilchasa, provided that it was ischachas according to halacha. So again, the same question is, my kehilchasa, obviously you have to have kosher ischach. So Amar Rav Chisda v'hu shasa l'tzeil sukkah. The answer is that all types of shack structures are kosher, provided that they were made to protect the occupant from the elements, to provide shade, right? But if it wasn't done for that purpose, then even if it fits all of the halachic criteria, since it wasn't made for sukkah and it wasn't made for protection, so then it's not a kosher sukkah. So now the question is, mikol makom li'isuye mai. What were these words, mikol makom, in the second brisa coming to include? Li'isuye sukkos ganbach. So it was coming to allude to the other brisa. So basically, what the Gemara is pointing out is we have 2 brises. The brisa of sukkos ganbach and the brisa of sukkos rakbash. Each brisa was aware of the other brisa and alluded to it by using the word sukkah mikol makom to allude to the other brisa. And now the Gemara makes an assumption that if you use the term sukkah mikol makom, which it basically means no matter how you make the sukkah, which implies that it's a much more a flimsy halachic application of the laws of sukkah. So therefore, the author of the first brisa feels that the sukkahs that are ganbach, the ones that are made by the non-Jew or the woman or the monkey, so those are much more solid as far as their halachic soundness. And even, he says, even sukkahs nakbash or rakbash which are made as huts temporarily, those two are going to be kosher. And the author of the second brisa says just the opposite logically. He says the sukkahs of Rakbash, the ones that I'm talking about, are much more solid from a halachic standpoint as being kosher as sukkahs, but even the sukkahs of Ganbach, of the other brisa, those two are kosher. So you see a slight difference of perspective. The author of the first brisa thinks that the sukkahs of Ganbach are much more solid from a halachic standpoint, and the author of the second brisa thinks that sukkahs of Rakbash are much more solid from a halachic standpoint. So what's the difference of opinion? So the Gemara says, Haitana de Ganbach, Alimale Ganbach, Mishum de Kevi. The katana mikol mokom lisi rakbash delo kevi. So the author of the first brisa, he feels that Ganbach is much more solid halachically. Why? Because these are more permanent structures. True, they're made by people that are not chayiv in the mitzvah, but lamaisa, structurally, these are more sound structures than the temporary huts and shacks and sentry posts that are built by shepherds, right? And that's why he said, even though they are not as sturdy from a structural standpoint, but they're still kosher as sukkahs as long as they're made for shade. V'haitana de rakbash, alima le rakbash de b'nei chiyuvaninu, v'tana mikol makom lasui ganbach de lav b'nei chiyuvaninu. And conversely, the author of the second brisa feels that rakbash sukkahs are more solid from a halachic standpoint because lamaisa, they were built by people who were chayiv in the mitzvah of sukkah. Even though structurally, from a physical standpoint, there may not be as sturdy as the types of sukkahs of the previous brisa, but they were built by people who were chayiv in the mitzvah. And that's why he holds that these are much more solid from a halachic standpoint. They're much on more solid halachic ground than the sukkahs of the first brisa, which are built by people who are not even chayiv in the mitzvah. And that's the difference of perspective.
More doesn't give a mucker why SUKKAH has to be done l'shem tzeil.
L'shem tzeil. Right. It doesn't give a makar, but I think perhaps we'll see this when we get into our next discussion, which is the machlokes between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. Now let's go on to the next Mishnah. The Mishnah says, Sukkah Yishana. If you have an old sukkah, so Beis Shammai postlun Beis Hillel machshirin. Beis Shammai says it's pasul, Beis Hillel says it's kosher. Now what does an old sukkah mean? So, ve'ezu hi sukkah yeshana, what is the definition of an old sukkah? Kol sha'asa kodem l'chag shloshim yom. Right? If you made the sukkah before 30 days before Sukkot, meaning Sukkot is on the 15th of Tishrei, if you make it before the 15th of Elul, it's called an old sukkah. But realize that there's one additional proviso, that you didn't make it for the purpose of the mitzvah of sukkah. Avol imasa l'shem chag, afilu mitchilas hashana keshera. But if you made it for the sake of a sukkah, then everyone holds it's a kosher sukkah, no matter how old it is. Meaning that no matter how old the sukkah is, even if it's a year old, as long as I designated it that I'm making it for a sukkah, then even Beis Shammai will acknowledge that it's kosher. What's the machlokes Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel? When I didn't make it l'shem sukkah, I made it for some other structural purpose. I made it for a potter's shed. I made it for watching the dry fruit. There you go. So in that situation, Beis Shammai says that if it's older than 30 days old, you can't use it as a sukkah. Beis Hillel says no. As long as it was made for protection from the elements, so then it's still a kosher sukkah, no matter how old it is, you can convert it into a sukkah. So the Gemara now says, my time into Beis Shammai. What's Beis Shammai's reasoning? Amar Kra, because the pasuk says, Chag HaSukkos Shivas Yamim Lashem, that there shall be a festival of Sukkah 7 days for God. Sukkah ha'asuya l'shem chag bo'inun. What we see from here is that you need that the sukkah shall be made for the sake of the festival of Sukkot. In other words, it has to be a festival of Sukkot, and it has to be for Hashem. And so, like Rashi says, Dichsiv Sukkos l'Hashem, it has to be a sukkah for God. It has to be a sukkah for the sake of serving God. Beis Hillel, hahumi boile lichda Rav Sheshis. Beis Hillel looks at that pasuk and says, I use it for a different purpose. The Amar of Sheshis mishum Rabbi Akiva, minayin la'atzei sukkah she'asur and kol shiva. How do you know that the materials that are used to build the sukkah, the wood that's used to build the sukkah, is considered to be muktzah for all 7 days, meaning you can't use it for any other personal benefit other than using it for the sukkah. Tamulomar Chag HaSukkah Shivas Yomim Lashem. As it says that the festival of Sukkah is 7 days for God. It's got to be completely for God. Vitanya Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira Omer, and the Bryce elaborates in the name of Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, Kishem Shechal Shem Shemayim Ala Chagiga, just like the name of God falls onto a korban chagiga, which is the festival korban. Kachal Shem Shemayim Ala Sukkah, so too does the name of God fall onto the sukkah, meaning that it's as sanctified as a sacrifice, because the Torah says Shenemar Chag HaSukkos. Chag is short for chagiga, so we're equating the sukkah that you make to a korban chagiga, and both of them are Shivas Yamim Lashem, are 7 days just for God. Machag Lashem, Av Sukkah Lashem. Just like a korban chagiga is for God and it cannot be used for personal use, so too the sukkah is for God and cannot be used for personal use. So therefore, Beis Hillel says, I don't hold of that, the way that Beis Shammai is learning that pasuk, that it has to be made l'shem the mitzvah sukkah, I don't agree with. I use the pasuk for something else. This is where we'll hold it for today, Rabosa. You have a wonderful day.